Welcome back. All right, this is a topic I've wanted to talk about for a while, so here I am. So wrestling has really changed over the last 25 years. Everything's really changed over the last 25 years. But there's something that I wanted to talk about because when I look at a WWE program or an AEW program, they both to me and I don't want to say it's an issue, but it's something that I've really noticed with wrestling in general that kind of takes some of the excitement out of it. Too much excitement. And there's a reason I say this. So back in the day, back in the 80s, when somebody went to the top rope, it was kind of a big deal. There were not very many wrestlers who did go to the top rope. They went to the second rope a lot for the double axe handle, usually. It might be a drop kick off the second rope, something like that. The top rope moves were reserved for certain wrestlers, you know. This was before the cruiserweights came in, and this was before, lucha wrestling became one of the major templates in North America. And so things have changed. And the one thing that I've noticed and frustrates me with wrestling is guys dive out of the ring so often now, it doesn't mean anything anymore. It used to be that like a guy'd be outside the ring and somebody would dive through the ropes and jump on him. You'd be like, man, he is mad. Look at that. That's great. You can't wait for a fight. Now they do it all the time. The dives mean nothing. They mean absolutely, and a wrestler's taking the risk of getting hurt. We've seen guys get hurt outside the ring on the floor, and so the all of the flips and the athletics and all that too. Again, it felt like that was reserved for certain wrestlers, and now almost everybody does it. And so I think for the audience, sometimes you take for granted how dangerous some of this stuff is. And I salute wrestlers for being able to go through this, get banged up, and continue to wrestle, but I just don't understand it because if you have one guy dive through the ropes in a show, that stands out. If everybody's diving outside the ring all the time, it doesn't matter. And you see it coming, it's telegraphed a mile away. One wrestler rolls out of the ring and is kind of staggering outside, turning, kind of looking towards the ring because you have to catch the guy, right? Wrestlers, you have to catch, and so as the wrestler's coming through the ropes, you catch him. It doesn't look very convincing, especially when you see it that often. And so that's part of the problem too. It kind of exposes things for me, anyways, because like I don't feel like the dive means anything. It's not like a guy dives outside the ring or a lady dives outside the ring on top of another and then rolls them into the ring and gets the 1, 2, 3. No, that doesn't happen. They fight a little bit outside, they go back in the ring. It doesn't accomplish anything either. And it used to be that if somebody climbed the ropes, the match was basically going to be done pretty quickly, and that's gone. Ladders, and this could, and I've got dots because it could be almost any weapon at this point. They don't seem to matter anymore either, and it's a dangerous thing to use, even though they're gimmicked ladders a lot of the time, and no, they're not the same, and the tables are gimmicked. But there's still this element of wow that's been lost. We see so many grudge matches now. We see so many no rules, everything goes that it you get numb to it. One thing that ECW had working against it, honestly, as far as I was concerned, was the hardcore element. That to me anyways, because I watched old ECW shows, it took the excitement out of a no DQ match when almost every match is no DQ. And it just makes it feel like, oh, all right, so there's no rules here, and good guys, bad guys, doesn't matter. Like, honestly, with ECW, my question was, does it matter? Everybody's breaking the rules anyways, there aren't any, so does it really matter who the good guys and the bad guys are? The steel cage, I feel like, has been diminished as well. So, again, when I started watching wrestling, the steel cage was kind of the big deal. Like, you build it up. So you have the cowardly heel, the cowardly bad guy is running away from the good guys and, not giving them a fair match, usually somebody with a title. And eventually that good guy or the face in the match says, I want you in a steel cage. Nobody comes in, nobody gets out, pinfall, or you exit over the top of the cage. And those matches were epic. There were one of the greatest matches I ever saw. Tito Santana winning the Intercontinental title over Greg the Hammer Valentine. In the NWA, Dusty Rhodes wins the world title over Ric Flair in a steel cage. Those matches I remember almost 40 years later because they were fantastic matches that for me as a kid I really invested in because the cage felt really important. And I think with all the wrestling we have now, which is what, 12, 13, 14 hours a week, it's hard to make things seem all that important now. Because again, when I was a kid, I would get 1 hour of NWA and I'd get 2 hours of WWE. And that was it. And then you had to wait till the next week. And you leave people wanting more, right? So, and the NWA at the time was, it was before they were WCW, and it wasn't technically, it was Worldwide Wrestling, right? That's what they used to call it. But and sure, there was Stampede as well, but each territory had its own feel. Each territory had its own brand, its own way of producing, and then WWE became the dominant one, and everybody else wanted to look like WWE, which I think is part of the problem as well. You need to build your own brand and make it look like your own thing, not like you're trying to copy the other guys, because you're always going to look like a knockoff of the other guys, which I don't think AEW does. Before anybody thinks I'm throwing shade at AEW, Impact has had that problem. Impact has absolutely had that problem. I think they learned from that mistake when they brought in Bischoff and Hogan, which was a disaster. One thing, too, the rest holds and match build is really not used as much. And I feel like it's because, well, we don't want the crowd to chant boring. And I haven't heard a crowd chant boring in a long time. And I know people don't like the boring rest hold wrestling. And I agree that sometimes it was overdone. But you want to build to it. You want to have a build. You don't want to go out there and have a match that's 3 minutes where everybody's flipping and diving all over the place and it's over. I would prefer a 15-minute match where, there's the feel out process, there's a strategy, you can see it. Each wrestler has their own style. One wants to take to the sky, the other one wants to keep it grounded, this kind of thing, right? And it feels like now that's kind of gone. Most wrestlers now are a hybrid of the high-flying style and the technical, and it just all kind of looks the same. And it doesn't feel like matches build anymore. If you put on an old Ricky Steamboat versus Ric Flair match, I guarantee you there'd be a lot of the younger crowd going, well, this match is kind of boring. When's something going to happen? But again, there was a psychology to it back then that's kind of gone now. And I feel like this is where the fact that we see all the behind-the-scenes stuff, and we know they're all friends with each other. Like on Celebrity Family Feud, they had the ladies of WWE against the men of WWE, and you had good guys and bad guys together because it doesn't matter anymore, which is fine. That in this day and age, you can't go back. You can't put the ketchup back in the tube. It's either in the bottle or toothpaste back in the tube. I don't want to get caught up on that. But anyways, it just feels like there's no slow builds in matches anymore, and there's no, okay, so he's applied this hold, what's next? One thing that I loved about wrestling back in the 80s and in the 90s was if you watched Ric Flair, he would pick a body part and just wear it out. And again, I know it's not real. I know it's all predetermined. But you would see this match that was choreographed in a way that he would, work the arm. Like, okay, this guy's got a bad shoulder. And Flair would just work on it. The guy he was against, whether it was, again, Ricky Steamboat, Barry Windham, Dusty Rhodes, whoever, would then sell it, right? Like, they looked like they're really hurt. And you would start to think to yourself, okay, is he actually hurt here? And that's the key. Wrestling should make you question. Like now we see, it's very rare, but we'll see, I think that person's really hurt. And then you'll find out after that they weren't. People like, wow, he did a really good job, or she did a really good job. That was the standard. And not only that, but wrestlers, you had to sell that injury outside of the match. So if you had a cast on, well, if you could wear that cast when you're out in public, great. Especially if you don't actually have an injury. And just go out and sell it. And so there's a lot of times where that doesn't happen, where you'll see, like for instance, going back to the Celebrity Family Feud, I love Liv Morgan. I think she's a fun wrestler. I wouldn't put her in the top 2 or 5 or 6 necessarily, the women in WWE, but her being on there while she's got an injury angle in WWE, like she can't be here and she's laughing and talking and she's fine. There's no sling, there's nothing. And I thought to myself, she could have put her arm in a sling. Like, I understand it might feel goofy and it might feel odd to people, but when you're selling that you've went on TV. You got injured by Rhea Ripley, and the idea is that she separated your shoulder. Does it hurt to sell that publicly? I don't think it does. Now, one thing that gets talked about a lot, and I will agree with this, the DDT is no longer a finisher. I don't understand this. I don't understand that in wrestling now, they've got maneuvers that are finishers that don't look like they hurt. People watching wrestling know what I'm talking about. There are finishers that you look at and go, huh. Like for Chris Jericho, the Judas effect. I don't understand how that's a finisher. The first time I saw it, I was like, that's the Judas effect. And I was like, he must have botched that. But I've seen it a bunch of times, and I'm like, okay, that's the finisher. It doesn't look anywhere near as devastating as a DDT. And yet a DDT, a move where you grab somebody in a reverse headlock, you drive their face into the mat, that's a 2 count. But an elbow, that's a 3. And I don't understand this. The DDT is a genuinely dangerous move. Most famously, Jake the Snake Roberts wrestling Ricky Steamboat. Steamboat saying, I want you to give me the DDT on the floor. And Jake Roberts answering with, I'll kill you. Like you could die. And Ricky Steamboat said, don't worry, I'll get my hands out. I'll protect myself. Just do it. It won't be a big deal. So Jake Roberts delivers the move. Ricky Steamboat did not protect his face. Lands headfirst on the pavement. And Jake basically had dead weight. He's rolling in the ring. He was out. He was out. So the DDT, if it's not delivered properly, is a very dangerous move. And I would argue even delivered properly, much like the pile driver, can be a very, very dangerous move. And yet moves that were sold as being, that's it, that's the end of it, like the DDT, now it's no big deal. No big deal. The figure 4 never wins a match that I've seen anymore. Although the figure 8 does, although I've never quite understood how the figure 8, I mean, I know Charlotte's got her back arched, which looks cool, but I don't see that being enough of a difference that it makes it that's an automatic tap, regardless of who you're against. It's weird to me, you know? And that's one thing with wrestling that throws me off is that moves that were devastating back in the day now are no big deal. And I'm going to throw this in here. It's in red ink because it's not necessarily related, but in terms of wrestling programming, I do think there's too many wrestlers in both AEW and WWE. There's a lot of complaints about who doesn't get pushed and who does. My argument is, look, not everybody can get pushed. There isn't enough room for everybody. And when you have too many wrestlers, yeah, there's going to be guys who are off TV that shouldn't be off TV because you have too many wrestlers. And there's only so much programming to go around. When you have 6+ hours of programming a week and you still can't find time for certain wrestlers, you've probably got too many of them. And it makes it difficult, especially, so in WWE you have rematches every week, and in AEW you have kind of random booking at times. And I don't think either of those things work. I think when it's the same matches every week, like on Raw or SmackDown, and it does happen that way, where there's a lot of rematches, it's boring. You're like, I've seen this. But in AEW, if you're having random matches, it might be great. You might have all the dives and flips, and maybe somebody grabs a ladder, or somebody reaches under the ring and pulls out a kendo stick. But is there an emotional investment in it if it's just a random match thrown together? No. You need to build it up. One thing I've talked about, too, is that back when I started watching wrestling, you would have a match like Hogan versus Andre. Hogan versus Andre was this big, huge deal, right? And they were kept apart. They had very little in-ring action against one another prior to WrestleMania when they fought each other. In fact, I don't think they had anything inside the ring until that WrestleMania match. Now you'll see guys who are, against one another, and they're in the ring every week. They're in the ring against each other every week. Sure, it might be a tag match, might be a 6-man match, but it takes away that feeling of, when you see them in the ring against each other, you're like, all right, here we go. It's one thing that MMA has going for it. It's one thing that I will give MMA every day of the week over pro wrestling, is that you can get guys in MMA go nose to nose in the ring, and people watching are going to say, I have been waiting for this match for a long time. I can't wait to see these guys against each other. And again, with MMA, it's not like you see them against each other 5, 6, 7 different times over a 2-month period in various forms of matches, because it takes away that special feeling when you see wrestlers against one another, and it's the first time that they've been in the ring with one another. And so that's something that throws me off, especially when You have too many wrestlers. Like you have all these wrestlers that aren't busy, and you've got a bunch of guys in the ring against each other who fought on Monday. They'll fight next Friday. They'll fight the following Monday, and then while we're at it, we'll have them fight again next month. It just feels like there's some time there that's not being used. And I'm gonna say this too: work rate does not equal a star. One thing that wrestling fans now don't seem to understand as much as, again, I understand this from the 80s. Some of my favorite wrestlers were jobbers. Some of my favorite wrestlers were guys who never won a match. And so if they actually won a match, I was really excited. I was like, holy crap, they won a match. I remember Barry Horowitz won a match. I went nuts. I was like, Barry Horowitz, back pat fever is on the way, because he always patted himself on the back before a match, and he lost every time. And so when he finally won a match, like, everybody went nuts. And we don't have that anymore, because now there isn't really that enhancement talent along the lines of what we had back then. And it doesn't mean that Barry Horowitz was a bad wrestler. On the contrary, Barry Horowitz was a good wrestler. When he would have a 10-minute match on Maple Leaf Wrestling, because you had the Canadian version, they'd usually show matches that had happened in Toronto or Montreal. And you would see a 10-minute match with a Barry Horowitz, a 10-minute match with a guy like Barry O, somebody who was a jobber. And they could go. They were good wrestlers, in good shape. And they could execute all the same moves as the main event guys. They just weren't over that way, and they weren't seen as being that top-level talent. So work rate does not mean a star. Like right now, LA Knight, and the funny part too, I wanted to address this too. LA Knight's ripping off The Rock and Stone Cold. Yeah, sure. Yep. Hulk Hogan ripped off superstar Billy Graham. Ric Flair was not the first Nature Boy. When we had Adrian Adonis dressing up and kind of ladylike in WWF, that wasn't the first time we saw that. There was Gorgeous George. Adrian Street was doing all kinds of weird stuff in the ring. And so, yeah, gimmicks have been passed down for generations. This is just how it works. I think one of the mistakes that people make now is the idea that, well, you can't copy that. Now, I'm not saying to copy, flat out copy, because Hulk Hogan was not exactly the same as superstar Billy Graham when it came to promos, when it came to his ring work. I actually liked superstar Billy Graham better, but that's a whole other discussion. I was never a Hulk Hogan fan. But again, the NWO, huge angle for WCW, not theirs, not originally. They took that idea, Japan had that idea first, and they went, hey, that could work, and they bring it over here. And they did their own spin on it. So as long as LA Knight's doing his own spin, I don't care. I don't care that he's dressed like Stone Cold. I don't care that he's talking like The Rock. If it works, if fans like it, that's what matters. Kevin Nash, of course, ruffled some feathers and complaining that he was just ripping off The Rock and Stone Cold. But again, wrestlers have been ripping each other off forever. I remember Shawn Michaels and Marty Jannetty, the Midnight Rockers. And I was like, oh, you mean like the Rock and Roll Express? And I preferred the Rock and Roll Express because I felt like they were the first ones over the Midnight Rockers, who then went to WWE and became the Rockers. And of course, Midnight Rockers was a combination of Midnight Express and Rock and Roll Express. But again, back then it was, yeah, everybody copies everybody. There were so many pretty boy tag teams that, you'd have two young guys, two young, usually good-looking guys tagging together, and a lot of the high-flying stuff you might see in the tag matches you weren't seeing in the regular matches. And it wasn't a big deal. We didn't care. I mean, if you did it poorly, so where it came off was when you saw, a discount version of another gimmick, and you were like, this is a bad version of this gimmick. This doesn't work. That's when people got mad. When you're like, you know what? Yeah, Abyss kind of has this Mankind quality to it, but Abyss is pretty cool. And I remember thinking that at the time, like, okay, I could see with Abyss kind of a Kane, Mankind kind of thing that got going on here, but he does his own spin on it. It's fine. So yeah, the idea that LA Knight's ripping off Stone Cold or The Rock, welcome to wrestling. They've been telling the same story. I think it was Jim Cornette that said, in the territories, you would tell the same story. And I think he said it was 12 years, and then you could recycle the same storyline. And of course, now you can't. But WWE's starting to try. I feel like Triple H is starting to try this to, bring in storylines that they've done before, but do a new bent on it. One comment that I've seen a couple times is that the Rhea Ripley, Dominic Mysterio is very similar to China and Eddie Guerrero from a 20 years before. Yes, it's similar. It's different, but it is similar. I can see the comparison there. But it works. It works because Dom is a perfect heel. Dominic Mysterio is the most natural heel right now in the business. I think he loves it. I really do. Every time he opens his mouth, the crowd boos so loud he can't speak. It is impressive. It is, and it's not the kind of heat where the crowd just wants him to go away either. It's just they hate him. And that when you've got that, it's absolutely fantastic. So I don't care if they're using an old storyline to do it with a new bent because it works, right? So I just wanted to mention that along with all of this, just the kind of stuff that just it eats away at me a little bit. So I let it build up. And then I do a video for all you fine people on the internet. But I will go back to my original comment here that we see a lot of wrestlers getting hurt. And I think it's part of it is because of the over-reliance on dangerous maneuvers. And dangerous maneuvers that because they do them all the time, I don't think as a fan, you really appreciate how dangerous those moves are sometimes because you get numb to it. You see guys jump off the top of the ring post onto each other 15 times a show. It's not going to matter. You're not going to think anything of it. And eventually, wrestlers jumping off the top of a steel cage doesn't seem to matter as much anymore. I used to wonder why. If you can climb to the top of the cage, why don't you just climb down the outside? Why are you jumping back in? But, hey, not every cage match necessarily is had where if you escape the ring. But usually that's one of the rules. I just never understood that. But it's one of those logical things that you can kind of maybe ignore a little bit. But let me know your thoughts. I'd be curious to know your thoughts in the comment section below. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. And yes, I talked about Love Island yesterday, wrestling today. That's kind of what happens with this channel. You never know what you might get. It's kind of like in that movie, Life is Like a Box of Chocolates. That was in Return of the Jedi, I do believe. Was Vader said that to Luke to try to break the tension down on Hoth. Anyways, thank you guys so much for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.